none of us are in an environment to automatically elicit the right response in us that will pertain to the survival of the species. Man's greatest enemy is man. And over the years, with the rise and fall of nations and the wars that go on, that the odds of man destroying man are so great, it becomes incumbent upon us to try to find out how to solve this. And the way in which most of the world is going about it, through the United Nations and otherwise, is going about it on the basis of what is close to common sense. And the literature supports the fact that underlying this is something that is far from common sense. And that,
which implies that the processes or the steps being taken currently by governments, by countries, may be incorrect or may be ineffective.
It looks like, since they're going at it with an implicit understanding of what the causes of inequality are about, and not making their implicit assumptions explicit and examining the evidence for it, that the solutions they put into operation are actually having the counter effect.
They exacerbate the problem rather than
Yes.
solve it.
There's a movement afoot, particularly because of the advancement in computers. Without the computers, I don't think this movement would be, but it relates to what I chanced upon 50 years ago and was demonstrated by the causal. So there is a movement afoot to illustrate what is happening and why this inequality is generated the way in which it is.
Does the movement have a name?
Well, I think perhaps it's difficult. It's one of those things where they put nomenclature on, but the conference held in India in 2005 had a title on it, the Econophysics of Wealth Distributions. But there's a whole area, and it comes under the rubric of the name complexity, chaos, very poor names.
Also, different disciplines have different labels.
Different labels, different vocabulary, and the fact is that all the disciplines are interrelated. It's very much the blind man and the elephant. So, to illustrate the problem, I'll come back to the causal, and it comes back to why the parable is important, and then I'll come back to the physical aspects of it, to the epiphany and the causal. The problem, by metaphor, is if we consider this and what goes on in here a land, call it causal land, where these balls are people making decisions at decision points. From their standpoint, they may be making an intuitive decision that they consider to be rational, or they may be tossing coins.
Are these economic decisions only?
No, it goes beyond that. It has nothing to do with betting decisions. It goes in with the chance of the genes that you get, your height gene. They're things we have nothing to do with whatsoever are operative. So it's all. But I'm using it. It's best to use it with It's convenient to use it with monetary because we can get our hands on data. And also it's motivating. So here is a land we call a causal land. And the view that we have within a causal land is very real. It's available to our senses, smell, taste, and such. It's available to our experiences. And we have a certain perception of what's going on. There's not a consensus because each person has traveled different paths and they have different perceptions. There's another world that is inaccessible. And I named it acausal land. And it's a view of what's going on here with no consideration of time and watching from the outside. And let's say that this is like the fourth dimension. And it's only accessible through abstraction, through mathematics, and through computer simulation, and then looking for empirical evidence to give you some confidence that that is what's happening. So here in a causal land, they view this inequality that is demonstrated in here one way. And it is different. It doesn't mean that one's more right than the other. In terms of the fact that you could talk about greed, power, and things of that nature, they may all be operative. But it is my opinion, and it's purely an opinion, the overlying cause, if you want to call it a cause, is that there is a power, a force field, like gravity, that is operating over time that contributes to this design, which is only visible out here. So here you have a paradox. If one of these balls goes out and somehow or other enters this dimension and learns to see from that dimension and comes back, that ball has a pretty good idea of what to do in order, selfishly from that ball's standpoint, to get into a desirable part where there is enough sustenance here for food, water, etc. But however, in order to do so, he cannot or she cannot do so without the cooperation of others. And of course, if the others have not experienced it, there's no vocabulary, there's no way to communicate it.
So in effect then, you have journeyed outside causal land.
Yes.
You have made the observation and come to the conclusion that there's something wrong with the environment, or that the environment in causal land can somehow be changed to elicit the correct behavior from the inhabitants. Is that the idea?
Really, I think it goes back, in some respects, simpler than that. I've identified a problem. Perhaps the greatest contribution I have is making that problem explicit and defined.
And leave the solution to others?
Well, because any thought I have of a solution is a solution of one person that may be so wrong, and I have no way of knowing.
Also, it might take a long time.
Well, I'm going to come to that. So, the point is that the people, for instance, working on econophysics, the people working on chaos theory and complexity and such, all related to these patterns, fractals, for whatever the reason is, and I don't quite understand it except perhaps my own personal experience over 50 years, is they have not brought this problem to the surface. That we're, in essence, at a breakthrough in social science that's going on, means that that we're dealing with non-common sense land, things that are not available to our senses.
Right. Now, doesn't that bring us back to the reason why you're focusing on the tangible reference that you referred to?
Yes, but I want to, can I, just before I come to that, is that the parable, if I do nothing more than help to precipitate a parable that is entertaining, and it catches on like Plato's allegory of the cave and flatland. Now, if you stop and think, if you take a look at the longevity of Plato's allegory of the cave, Plato was making a point so many thousand years ago, the same point I'm making. And this is, and those people who've recognized it through their academic or other experience, it is, I think, contributed to the length of that popularity of that allegory. It's basically saying that here you're brought up in the cave, you don't see the light. You travel out and see the light, and then return, and you're faced with the problems I've just demonstrated, but the causal just adds another dimension to it. What hasn't happened is that in view of what has transpired since Plato's time, we haven't updated it. And all I'm doing is really updating Plato's cave using the causal as a physical demonstration to try to get across what I perceive. I would have had difficulty keeping all this in mind without that device. So now let's examine this. what we're dealing here with is the creation of a new belief system, which is really a faith. It's a faith that a pattern similar to the circle exists, or patterns. They're not, one of the problems with this is the pattern isn't fixed. It's a varying pattern. It goes through cycles. And so there is this faith that that pattern exists, and that pattern explains, and that if we act according to the pattern, we'll act according to the laws of gravity, and then we will come up with ways of addressing inequality that are much more realistic. But that is such a major change in our belief system, because we all live within the causal. That's a really a big thing to swallow. Mm-hmm. And not only that, since there is no cause and we're brought up completely dependent on causation, when there isn't cause, we dream up cause. I think religions have been built up that way. Mm-hmm. So this has been very frustrating, because the same way as the prisoner returning to the cave is frustrated, and the square returning to flat land is frustrated, it's very frustrating to me. And also I'm taking on, I don't know the solution to the problem. I do believe that there is a partial solution, in that children must be brought up from the day they're born to deal with the acausal. That if they're so conditioned in their first 5 years on causality, you may never be able to undo that. Mm-hmm. So how in the world do you develop an environment that equips them to experience a causal? So I came to the conclusion that since probability is taught with coin tossing, all courses in it, is that, and in coin tossing this pattern evolves, but you don't ever see it. So what would happen if in our educational system coins you became ubiquitous, that were like this? Mm-hmm. It would motivate the teachers to teach a certain way, and it would, and children from the day they start learning about money, if it would be into the monetary system, I would have helped create an opportunity for mankind to come in contact visually with that pattern. So it's one thought. This can be a business, because if in turn in the case of the Perth Mint, who've already minted collector's items on coins with, I don't know if I have the sample up here, yes I do, with moving parts in it, this could be a commemorative coin for all those people who have contributed to this type of thing. So that's a tangible, and that could be a profitable business in starting off with it, but that was not my motive. But it's a tangible, mm-hmm. and that helps create an atmosphere.
Finish that. An atmosphere.
That creates an atmosphere that is perhaps more conducive to learning. It will be one time in the history of man where children and man in general have commerce with that pattern.
Got it. I
believe that pattern has to be raised to the level of importance similar to the circle. But there's some traps involved in that pattern. But nevertheless, it has to be raised that way. Now, it so happens that there is mathematics involved in that. This is geometry, but there's algebra involved in it. And within that algebra are two numbers, e and pi, because the distribution can be described ideally under function of x is equal to e raised to the power of minus pi x squared.
Got it.
And these numbers, e and pi, are as important to man, and in some respects maybe more important, than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes.
And again, these numbers have no existence in reality. So if you can bring up generations where they have come in contact with EI, pi, and phi, physically come in contact, and then learn the history of how these numbers were discovered and how the whole world is dependent upon the discovery of these numbers, again, it may help to make what is not available to the senses a little bit more so. So we know that mathematicians react emotionally to Euler's equation that takes these numbers that were independently discovered and relates them. So by doing it in an artistic form, it provides an icon, a symbol. So what we have here, if we are dealing with a new faith, and any breakthrough in a social science will be the equivalent of a new faith. And this again has not been identified. And will have all the barriers involved in trying to establish a new faith. You're even, it mitigates about even using this word, because when I speak to Susie, for instance, she says, don't say that, don't say that.
What's the word?
Religion, faith, comparing it, you know, because there's a preconceived notion. And that preconceived notion is inhibiting learning. If I said, what is an antonym for science? What comes to mind?
Religion.
Well,
But it's not.
It's not. But that's a mental set.
Yeah.
That,
maybe the church wants it that way.
well, I don't know whether, yes, they may, but on the other hand, it just may be one of those events of history. If you look up, if you go to a dictionary of antonyms, synonyms, and put in cause, there's no antonym.
Interesting.
There's none.
Our language is impeding our perceptions.
Well, we have the same problem in this subject matter as the square coming back from Sphereland and describing what up is to his colleagues.
And they thought he was crazy.
He has no way of sharing. So by creating the word a causal, at least we're creating something that that we can talk about it. And so there are certain words. Now, in essence, there's a very real problem here, because Mr. Ball in a causal land is now subjected to an inescapable paradox. And I created the word paraboxed. Because two things are true and they seem to be in conflict with each other. So how does he live under those circumstances? So I believe that if you said rate the contribution that you may have to the future generations, I think I would put the description of the problem and the identification of the problem at the top of the list. Because as much as I'm taken by the epiphany and the acausal, they are possible solutions.
But only possible.
But only possible solutions. The actual identification of the problem and defining the problem in a manner that is acceptable in entertainment, because if you propose it, it is so unattractive that it's more rewarding to ignore it, regardless of the subsequent consequences of the thing.